Before we move for food for thought here, we have a really great keynote speaker, and I have a little story to tell you about why David is here. I literally picked up his book at the Sydney airport on the way to Washington, read it, and it's a thriller, but it's a thriller that scares the living daylights out of you. And it's one of these synthetic books that brings together a lot of different ideas, but what David brings to it is a really deep dive investigatory journalism that, I don't know, I think it's a dying breed in some ways because you need a lot of money. You need a big newspaper like New York Times to fund you, to support the reporting, to do the work, but also to protect you. When, understandably, some people find your reporting to be perhaps sensitive, even detrimental to the national security. My first really encounter with David was when he exposed the Nitro Zeus, was that the name of it? Or
Olympic Games probably is one you were thinking of.
Olympic Games.
We'll talk about today.
The sort of scary sequel to Stuxnet, and also other forms of cyber war. He's been on, I think, 3 Pulitzer Prize-winning teams, and he is going to be speaking about the book, but also, I hope, because first thing I did, of course, go into the index, and after searching for my name and not finding it, I then went to—
It's called a Washington read.
I know, that's right. I know, the bookstore where that happens, too. And I did look up quantum, and it's in here. So maybe we'll get him in the Q&A to talk a little bit, extrapolate to, what are the implications, repercussions when this all takes that step change into quantum artificial intelligence, quantum war, but also, as we debated today, quantum diplomacy. Not a term that I coined, but actually Secretary of State Schultz. So it's David's floor, and he's going to speak for somewhere between 20 to 30 minutes. Then I hope a robust Q&A.
Great. Well, thank you, James. James called me when he still had the book in his hand when he landed and asked me to come out here. And fortunately, this has come as timing would have it so that my next stop can be Hanoi to watch just whether or not the Trump-Kim meeting works out just about as well as the last one did. So I'm here for a few days doing a few things for the Times. But I was delighted to do this. And this conversation, I hope in the Q&A we will link back to the last part of what you just did, which was a discussion, of course, of how all of these technologies coming together may affect nuclear stability and so forth. One more word on what I do at the Times. I'm a national security correspondent. I've been, over the years, a foreign correspondent. I've covered the White House during the Clinton and Bush years, chief Washington correspondent. But most of my reporting has been in the space between national security reporting and new and emerging technologies. So Bill Broad and I write a lot on American nuclear issues. That's why Peter's got to avoid us at all costs. And I also have written a lot on cyber and really started doing so about, more than 10 years ago, 3 books ago, for a book called The Inheritance, which was about what President Bush was leaving President Obama other than the war in Iraq. And a good deal of it included material that I had learned about Bush authorizing the first computer attacks on the Iranian nuclear program. And I'm going to walk us a little bit through that because it gets you into that acceleration stage that we're so worried about as we move to command control communications issues in the nuclear modernization. Let me start with this photo, which for Americans of a certain age has a certain resonance. The file cabinet on the left-hand side, which any Americans in the room might remember, is actually the file cabinet that was in the basement of the Watergate Hotel. It was one of them that the Watergate burglars broke into. If you look carefully at the bottom handle, you'll see it's missing from the bottom drawer there. That's because they jimmied it off trying to open the cabinet that night. For those of you who don't remember this bit of history, the Watergate burglars had taped open the door, gone in, grabbed the files out of this thing, got caught because a guard had noticed that the door was taped open. Now, to the right of the file cabinet, you see something that looks like an oversized laptop sort of wrapped in some plastic. We didn't stage this photo. We saw it in December of 2016 when we went in to begin to try to piece together what had happened in the Russian hack of the DNC. That machine you see to the right is the famed DNC server. That's the one the Russians got into. We all think of this stuff in the cloud, but it's actually got to be someplace, and that was the place. Every once in a while, you'll read President Trump tweeting, "What about the missing server? What about the missing server?" And one day, finally, I just posted this photograph. I said, "I don't think it's missing." So there you have it. What's notable about this? That the Russians who got into the server didn't have to prop open a door, didn't have to enter the country. In fact, they didn't actually have to leave their offices in Red Square except for lunch. We know when they left for lunch because Dutch intelligence, as it turned out, was all over them. And if you actually want to read something interesting about their operations, one of the most interesting indictments that Mueller has issued, he issued last summer, delineating exactly what the Internet Research Agency and then the GRU, the Russian military intelligence agencies, had done to get into this server, mostly the GRU. And you see their emails back and forth, their text messages back and forth. And if you think about what changed between Watergate time and the modern time, is that none of us can remember a single document that was in that file cabinet because none of them were made public and they turned out to be incredibly boring. We can all remember a few things that were in that server because they all got made public and they led to the resignation of the head of the Democratic Party just days before the convention happened in 2016, and it was part of the incredible circus that got triggered by the Russian hack and may continue well into the next few weeks if we see the Mueller report as quickly as we think we are going to. This was the most dramatic demonstration of an element of the cyber age that we were not looking for. If I was giving you this talk before the Russia hack, we would be talking about whether or not the Russians could take out the power grid from Boston to Washington, or whether or not they could get into the nuclear weapons enterprise, as we were discussing with command and control, or whether or not they could turn off the gas pipelines. It would be infrastructure kind of issues. But we're all been focused, at least in the United States, for the past 2 years on the captivating issue of this mix of hacking and then the social network operations, which were basically just old-style propaganda put on steroids by cyber means. But it was a reminder that something really dramatic has happened in the past 10 years. That cyber attacks have not only become pervasive, but they have now become the primary way that states exercise short-of-war operations against other states. The primary way. And that for years we were looking for the perfect technological solution for this. You could scare almost anybody into buying the latest version of Norton antivirus or Symantec or whatever, and we convinced ourselves that if we just had the right technology around, we could stay ahead of the threat. Well, we now know that most of those products, not all of them, there are a couple of AI-driven ones that are quite interesting that anticipate where attacks will be coming, but most of them were just looking at known attacks. And therefore, they were always behind the curve and got more and more behind the curve. We also know that the Internet of Things has changed this whole battlefield dramatically, and that terrorism and climate change are issues that we understand we're going to be battling with perpetually. But I discover when I go around the country talking about cyber and talking about the book, most Americans at least have not thought about cyber as something that they will be managing for decades or beyond as a threat. They don't think of it the same way we think of managing disease or managing climate. Now, the intelligence community in the United States was a little bit slow to this as well. If you go back 12 years to the Worldwide Threat Assessment, which is the document the intelligence agencies turn out for Congress each year, they just did it 2 or 3 weeks ago, and that was the one that led to the president's ire that they contradicted him on Iran, on North Korea, and on ISIS. He solved it by bringing all of the intelligence chiefs into the White House the next day, and they agreed that the problem was the way it was reported in the press. If you go to the 2007 assessment, it's just 6 years after 9/11, it says terrorism is the preeminent threat. No great surprise there. The problem is, if you go to read the cyber section of the 2007 threat assessment, there isn't one. Won't take much of your time. Only 12 years ago. Now, a few weeks after that came out, Steve Jobs brought out the first iPhone. If you're looking for the iPhone 1, go to your bedside table. It's in the back of the top right drawer, and you haven't pulled it out in years, but it feels like it weighs a ton these days. And that began to change everything because, of course, at that moment, hackers no longer just had to get into a central network. They could get into an endpoint device and count on you walking it in to wherever you needed to be. And so for the last 6 years, cyber has been viewed as the number one threat by the intelligence community. This is what they said 2.5 weeks ago. Our adversaries and strategic competitors will increasingly use cyber capabilities, including espionage, attack, and influence, to seek political, economic, and military advantage over the United States and its allies. Wouldn't be surprising to anybody in this room, but think what happened 5 days after they made that statement. The president went out, gave a State of the Union address. You would have thought from that our problems at the southern border, the need to build a wall, was our number one threat. Cyber occupies page 1 through 10 of the new threat assessment, and the first issues that remotely might deal with issues over the border begin on page 18 with a brief reference to cartels. So we have a mismatch between where the political discussion is in the country and where the intelligence and, of course, the technical discussion is. And it would not be the first time in history we've had that. But in this case, I would argue, for all the reasons you were talking about this morning, it's particularly damaging. So the main adversaries, you know, these come right out of the report: China, Russia, and North Korea. What's interesting about them is that each one of these countries has now identified uses of cyber that fit their own national interests. So every one of them is a different player. You know, the Chinese are stealing intellectual property or looking to compile huge databases. The Russians are being disruptive. The North Koreans are looking for a way to show that they can reach out even if they don't have nuclear weapons, that they can be operating for some period of time, and of course to raise money. Then of course we've had a rethinking of threats here. And what you do understand out of this, and you've seen it in your own discussions here, is 10, 15 years into this game, we're not much further along on the question of deterrence than we were. And that's remarkable, maybe not surprising. In the nuclear age, MAD didn't emerge right away. People worked with different concepts before we got to that by the late 1950s. It was about 15 years into the process. Before I went to write The Perfect Weapon, I went back and reread something I had last read in college, which was Henry Kissinger's book, Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy, which was the first effort to try to begin to explain deterrent capabilities to ordinary Americans, not just to the technical community. And what's remarkable about the nuclear moment there was that we managed to have a big debate about how we should use nuclear weapons and what the risks of that are, that ended up in a completely different place than it began. I mean, it began with MacArthur wanting to go use nuclear weapons against the North Koreans. We now know Westmoreland wanted to have nuclear weapons at the ready in South Vietnam to use against North Vietnam if the Battle of Khe Sanh had gone bad. We now know of other cases where nuclear weapons were nearly employed. And today, we know that most presidents, Democrats and Republicans alike, have all concluded you would only use nuclear weapons as a matter of survival. That was the product of a big public debate. We have never had the parallel debate about cyber, much less the issues you're discussing here today of how we would use quantum computing and AI. It's taken a while for people to understand that the big threat is not the cyber Pearl Harbor. This phrase you've heard time and time again, and Leon Panetta made it a big deal when he gave a speech on the deck of an aircraft carrier that's parked on New York's west side. I was having lunch with him a couple of weeks ago. I was out near giving talk like this near the Panetta Institute, and we went off to catch up with each other. And at some point, around coffee, I said, Leon, why was it that you used cyber Pearl Harbor when you know that that's probably the least likely thing to happen, since it would bring about a military response? It's the one thing actually we have managed to deter. And he said, oh, David, that's easy. If you don't use a phrase like that in Congress, they're never going to fund this stuff. You had to come to an analogy that they sort of all understood and were scared of. So if he talked about data manipulation or all of the other sort of slower uses of the technology, he knew he would lose them. And he was right. So as we have tried to get people to understand what the nature of this threat is like, what's it most like that we remember in history? It's not actually the nuclear weapon. Cyber is the opposite of a nuclear weapon, right? Cyber is the perfect weapon because it's cheap, it's scalable, you can dial it up and dial it down to your heart's desire. It's hard to figure out where it came from, hard to do the attribution, and therefore it's the perfect weapon for countries that are broke. Think Vladimir Putin, think Kim Jong-un. Nuclear weapons, in contrast, you need a lot of infrastructure. You need millions, if not billions of dollars. You need plutonium, you need uranium, you need big facilities. For cyber, you need some teens, some 20-somethings, some stolen code from the NSA. Unfortunately, there's a lot of that floating around. A case of Red Bull, and you're kind of ready to go. And that is the reason that you have seen this become such a pervasive weapon. But initially, we understood it as a surveillance weapon. We didn't actually think of it in terms of, we thought of it as a surveillance device. We didn't really think of weaponization. And that's why it's more like the early days of the airplane. This picture was taken in College Park, Maryland. Any of you who've been to the University of Maryland at College Park, this is sort of where the soccer field is now. And the Wright brothers came up there with the military flyer because they were broke. And they needed to sell this to some army generals if they were going to have enough money to keep going. They had actually initially tested the thing down by the Potomac, and people were taking picnics out. There was the first American casualty from an airplane. A military officer was killed when one of the Wright brothers' planes sort of did a nosedive. And they realized they had to move up here when President Taft came out and started insisting on a ride. And they suddenly began thinking that this would be aerodynamically challenging. So they went up here and they flew this thing around, and the generals who looked at it said, this is great. We'll fly it over enemy lines. We'll see where the weaknesses are. The pilot will come back and tell us what to go hit, and we'll send in the cavalry. They never actually discussed arming the damn thing until, of course, World War I comes along, and we saw this. And then by the beginning of World War II, the Japanese had figured out how to miniaturize the technology and turned it into the Zeros. My dad is now 95, but he was the fighter director in, not all that far from here, on a destroyer in the Pacific. He was at Iwo Jima and so forth. Always said these things sounded like lawnmowers coming at them. And then, of course, we combined it with that technology and ultimately with this. It was a 30-year time period, roughly 35 years, between the time the Wright brothers first showed the Army generals the weapon and the time it was used like this. Of course, when they showed it to them in 1909, no one could have ever conceived of an atomic bomb, hadn't been yet invented. And so there was no way to know that their device would be the delivery vehicle. And that makes you wonder whether where we are in cyber right now, and as we think toward quantum and AI, is sort of at the end of World War I. That we've had a few skirmishes, we've had a couple of casualties, but nothing very serious. And we are waiting now to see what the warhead is that gets matched with the delivery vehicle. So what have we seen cyber used for? Espionage, data manipulation. You discussed earlier today basically what the risks would be in nuclear, but I could give you a more prosaic option. If you could get into the database of all the soldiers and sailors in the US military and change their blood types, you would do an awful lot of damage pretty fast. Destructive purposes of the kind that we were discussing before, doing via cyber what could previously be accomplished only by sabotage or bombing. And then, of course, achieving political goals, perhaps through influence operations. I'm not going to spend any time on espionage. The plane on the left, of course, is our F-35, the most expensive airplane any Americans in the room have ever paid for. On the right is the Chinese version of it, a third cheaper, based on getting the plans out of a good attack on Lockheed Martin, 10, 15 years ago, good cyber attack that ended up bringing in the designs. The attacks on physical infrastructure get a lot more interesting. This is Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the previous president of Iran, walking through the Natanz nuclear enrichment site. And this is what James was referring to before when he referred to Stuxnet. Stuxnet was just the commercial name given to a virus that was, or actually a worm, that was much more sophisticated than any we had seen before in history. And you'll remember that in the summer of 2010, it began spreading around the world. It spread around the world because somebody made a mistake, either the Israelis or the Americans. I have sat in conference rooms in the White House and heard the Israelis get blamed. I have sat in conference rooms at the Mossad and heard the Americans get blamed. Whoever did it, it was an accidental mistake. But the concept was pretty clear. Back in 2006, 2007, when President Bush could not announce that Iran was trying to build a nuclear weapon because he had already announced that about another country and invaded it, and it didn't work out so hot. A group of generals and intelligence officials came to him in the Oval Office and said, "Sir, we think we have another way to go do this. We think that we can design a bug that will get into the SCADA systems, the computer controllers, that Iran uses to control these centrifuges. And that we can then speed them up or slow them down so that they will vibrate out of control and ultimately explode." Remember, inside these centrifuges is a very thin tube that spins at supersonic speeds, and that's what separates out the heavier and lighter uranium elements, so that you can have a more purified version of uranium. And that piping across the top is what really connects each one of these together. And when the Iranians released this photograph, they did a huge favor to the US intelligence officials who were trying to figure out how you would design a program that would affect many of these connected centrifuges. So Bush didn't initially believe they could make this work. So he authorized them to go out to the Tennessee laboratory where we had a bunch of these, thanks to the fact that Muammar Gaddafi had given up his nuclear weapons, very nascent nuclear weapons program. And we had stored these in the Tennessee lab. So they grabbed them, told the people who had them not to really expect them back in very good condition, built a replica of this lab in a hillside in Tennessee, attacked it with the code, and sure enough, over time, made the centrifuges blow up. They then packed the shards of the pieces together, and they flew them to Washington, dumped them out in the conference room table in the Situation Room, and invited President Bush to come down and look. And he looked and said, Yeah, this is a nice academic conference. I shouldn't tell you what he said. It was an earthy Texanism, let's just put it that way, which they took as approval to go ahead and move ahead with the program and do the attacks, which they did. And it worked beautifully, got handed off to Obama until that summer of 2010 when it got out. And when it got out, we realized that we could pick apart both the source code and get people who knew about this and begin to figure out first who wrote it, and then the political story behind it, which is what I published in 2012. And that was the core of another book called Confront and Conceal about Obama's first term. This won me a 4-year-long FBI leak investigation. I don't recommend them. They're not especially pleasant, but as James said, it pays to work for an organization that's got its own legal team and actually tells the US government when they tell you they're going to investigate you, take a ticket and get in line. We've got like a long list of these, right? This turned out to be the critical moment in cyber because we had never seen a state use such an incredibly sophisticated weapon in a short-of-war operation against another state. This was, of course, how it worked. I won't bore you with that right now. What is important to know is that President Obama said as he was picking out targets in the Situation Room for these centrifuges, picking cyber targets in the same room that Lyndon Johnson had picked targets in Vietnam. He said, you know, one day it's going to come out that we did this. And when it does, every country that's attacking us anyway or wants to attack us is going to use it as an excuse to go do what they wanted to do anyway. And that's what happened. The Iranians immediately went after Saudi Aramco, the biggest oil producer, wiped out about 30,000 of their computers. The North Koreans went after South Korea. The Russians went after the State Department, the White House, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And we never named them in public because we thought it was just espionage. And as a result, blew our one opportunity to brush them back before the 2016 election. The Iranians went after the Sands Casino in Las Vegas. Can you imagine anything nastier? A way to go attack a country than go after its casinos? I mean, really, okay? Why this one? Because Sheldon Adelson, who's a big conservative contributor to many conservative causes, had been at Yeshiva University in New York and said, want to teach those Iranians a lesson? Just drop a nuclear weapon in the sand outside of Tehran and send them a note and tell them the next time it's Tehran that'll be our target. Well, he was being recorded on YouTube. And it turns out the Iranians get YouTube. Who knew? So they're thinking Sheldon Adelson, Sands Casino, he owns it. Be a shame if his guys walked in one day and the casino was melted down. And that's exactly what happened to their hard drives. There was a German steel mill that we believe the Russians went after. There's the Sony case we'll get to in a minute and the Office of Personnel Management. And we now know that the Office of Personnel Management and the Marriott hack were actually linked. And I'll talk about that in a moment. So this was the Sony attack. This was a really great poster for a really terrible movie. Have any of you actually seen it? Come on, admit. Wow. I've asked this question in rooms of 150 people and not gotten this many hands up. For the few of you who did not raise your hand, I can now save you 2 hours of your life. Watch something else, okay? But for those of you who don't remember or have been trying to force it out of your mind, Rogan and Franco play two journalists who are sent off to go interview Kim Jong-un. The CIA grabs them and hires them to assassinate him. I've been hanging around newsrooms for 36 years now. If you were to go pick a group less suited to be hitmen, I can't think of one that would fit that role more than journalists. Guaranteed to screw it up. The North Koreans hear about this movie before it's coming out. They ask Sony about it, they threaten Sony, Sony ignores them. They do the only natural thing that you'd all do if you wanted to stop a movie from coming out. They wrote a long letter to the Secretary General of the United Nations. Because we all know just how much influence he has in Hollywood. When that had the predictable result they decided to go off and attack Sony's computer systems. Now, it was a really interesting decision. The guy they sent to go do it is this guy. We only know this 4 years later when he just got indicted a few months ago. He led the team. They were in China, they were in Malaysia and Thailand. Sony was wide open. They had never really thought seriously about cyber protection. The North Koreans got in, and just as we did in Stuxnet, they spent months mapping out how the computer system connected to administration, to movie making, to all kinds of stuff. They got into the email system. They made some of the emails public, sort of an early version of what the Russians later did. You may not remember it because the biggest news that came out of it was that Angelina Jolie is incredibly difficult to work with on the set. It was not much of a story for us, but the National Enquirer loved it, okay? Our intel was completely turned off to this. General Clapper, who you see there on the left, was in North Korea to win the release of an American at the time that the Sony attack was underway. But he didn't know anything about it, and as he points out, it's because the way our intelligence system is designed, we can look in foreign systems, but we can't look, for all kinds of good reasons, in domestic ones. And so there would have been no way to see it. And of course, Sony was tuned out. The guy he's meeting there in the middle, by the way, was the head of the Reconnaissance General Bureau who was running the attack. He took Clapper out to dinner, great Korean meal, stuck him with the bill. And you can't use American credit cards in North Korea. They had to go scrape together all the cash the American delegation had to pay for dinner. This guy later showed up in the White House in the Oval Office last year. Do you remember that picture of somebody with a giant white envelope inviting President Trump to the first summit? Looked like the president had just won the Publishers Clearinghouse sweepstakes. That's the guy. Okay, so he ran the attack. And on attack day, this is what people at Sony saw on their screens. It was meant to be just a complete distraction for the fact that their hard drives were being wiped clean. They lost 70% of their computing power in about 2.5 minutes. They ended up printing their payroll out of these old 1960s payroll machines somebody found in the basement. That's how frozen they were. Now, think about what it would have taken to do that kind of attack in a pre-cyber age. You would have had to land at Long Beach, taken an Uber up to the studio, gotten on the studio tour with all the 7-year-olds and the Mickey Mouse hats and the whole bit, stuck dynamite underneath the computer center and run like hell as it blew up. And if it blew up, what was going to happen? Whoever was president, I don't care if it was a Republican, a Democrat, a Martian, they would have had to make something blow up in Pyongyang. But because there was no burning building on CNN, what's the worst that happened to the North Koreans? They got some sanctions. That came out of a briefing the president had. That is not the briefers. Those are actually a scene from the movie. I did find the real briefers. This is what the briefer said to Obama. "I never thought I'd be here briefing on a bad Seth Rogen movie, sir." Obama said, "How do you know it's a bad movie?" He said, "Sir, it's a Seth Rogen movie." Obama later told me he actually likes Rogen movies, but you know. Anyway, they spent a month trying to figure out how to respond to this. And in the end, the president came out and made a First Amendment argument. Not that it was an attack. They were debating, is this an act of war? Well, no. Is it an act of sabotage? Probably. Obama, in an interview, called it an act of vandalism. He came to regret that. It was clearly more than that. But what it got at was, we not only were unprepared for the attack, we didn't even know how to categorize it. I mean, we all love going to the movies, but it's not exactly critical infrastructure, right? And yet our election system, later on, we discovered, wasn't on the critical infrastructure list. But movie theaters are. Go figure. Okay. So in the end, all we did was a group of sanctions that I suspect the North Koreans never felt amid all the other sanctions. And we got the Chinese to shut down their internet for about a day or two, right? Which in Pyongyang is sort of a weekly event anyway. So it really got at our inability to understand how quite to respond to these. At the same time that Sony was going on, the OPM debacle was happening. OPM is the most boring bureaucracy in Washington. It is the group that gathers just all the files for the security clearances that any Americans here who've ever had to get a security clearance had to get. And it's an incredibly long process, and you fill out this big form that lists your financial condition, your medical conditions, your kids, every foreigner you've ever met, every relationship you've ever been in. You can imagine why you might want this document to be, say, encrypted. None of the 22 million were encrypted. Where were they stored? In the computer system of the Department of the Interior, where they got all the protections that, say, bison migration in Yellowstone get, right? The Chinese came in, they spent a year clearing it out to steal it. They encrypted it on the way out, which was very kind of them, I thought. No kidding. A couple of weeks after I wrote about this, a friend of mine calls and said, David, have you seen the Federal Register this morning? I said, I don't really read it every morning. He said, well, if you go into it, you'll see a contract to encrypt this data after the Chinese had stolen it. And so I wrote a little story about this, and I suggested in the course of this that maybe we should just give the contract to the Chinese and say it had already done the work. And I get this formal letter from the General Counsel of OPM that says, Dear Mr. Sanger, this is to inform you that only American companies and American citizens can participate in. And I'm thinking, I think I'm understanding the problem with these guys, okay? So, what were the Chinese doing? It's a really interesting case. In a pre-cyber age, in an age before big data, in an age before AI, they never would have known what to do with 22.5 million files of that detail. But with big data techniques, you can go figure out that James worked with Paul, worked with Mary, they were all in the same nuclear laboratory. Then if you happen to have gotten into the Anthem medical system as they did and stolen hundreds of thousands, if not millions of files, you can begin to compare that with medical records. And if you broke into Marriott, or in that case it was the Starwood database, you can figure out who's traveling and when and where and correlate those with all of those files. Now, to the US government, this was just advanced espionage. It was like the master course in how you go do this. I would argue that at a moment that you have got that much information on 7% of the US population, you've done more than espionage. And it gets right to the questions that you guys are asking at this conference, which is, what happens when you ramp that to the next stage? So, this problem's about to get worse. The second to right item here shows you that we now have about 14 billion Internet of Things devices in the world at the end of last year. This is going to be about 20 or 21 billion by the end of 2020, the end of next year. So while we are improving our cyber defenses and you're all using two-factor authentication and feeling good about it, the problem is increasing exponentially with devices over which we have no standards over what kind of security has got to be in them. This exchange comes from when Paul Nakasone, whose life you'll learn a lot about in the book, was going through confirmation as the head of the NSA and US Cyber Command. And the conclusion he came to was, nobody fears us, and that's the reason that we've got such a cyber defense problem. But I'm not sure that fear is just the only issue that we have to go deal with here. We have discovered that every time we think we understand where our vulnerabilities are, somebody goes and finds a new one. In the AI world, we're going to find even more. Think of an example that I have at the back of the book. There's a chapter called Left of Launch, and it describes a secret US program to go get inside North Korea's missile tests. You'll remember there was a period of time when the North Koreans were launching missiles and they were dropping into the ocean at an astounding rate. An 88% failure rate, which my colleague Bill Broad and I looked at and said, yeah, this is a little bit too high for a really well-known, well-understood system. And it turned out, as we looked into it, that the US was well into both cyber and electronic warfare techniques that could get at the missiles. I wasn't revealing any great national security secret. Kim Jong-un had figured this out, stopped all of these before we wrote, and moved to a different technology that was working better. But in the course of the reporting, and I'll leave you with this thought, we asked people, if you're willing to go into the command and control system of the North Korean missiles, are you also willing to go into the Chinese and the Russian ones? And the first thing they said was, no, I don't think we'd do that, because once we created that as a norm, then suddenly everybody would wonder whether their missiles would launch when they press the big button. And if they don't have confidence they will launch, they'll probably press the button earlier. And thus, the technology itself introduces a new strategic instability into the system. Was this ever discussed at high levels of the US government? Turns out no. It was a discussion among people who were working on the program. I can't find a moment where this actually got a sit-room airing the way it would have for equivalent issues in the 50s and 60s. That takes you to the question of whether in this AI and quantum age, we now need something of a digital Geneva Convention that begins to decide what's walled off to the rest of the world. Whether you want to say, we're not going to attack power grids, or we're not going to attack nuclear infrastructure, or we're not going to attack emergency controls and emergency communication systems. My guess is that if we went down that road, we wouldn't get very far. I would guess that the US's own intelligence agencies, and maybe the British, and maybe the Germans, and maybe the French, would say, we may need to be able to do that to unplug an entire country rather than go to war with them. And that was the essence of a program called Nitro Zeus, which I write about in the book, which was an effort to have a plan in place to unplug all of Iran on the first day of battle so that you wouldn't have to drop any bombs. It never got executed. Might happen yet, who knows? Hope it doesn't. But it tells you what a new era we are in, one in which the cyber weapon gets exercised first. But the escalation ladder, we still don't understand. So I'll leave it at that and go to your questions. I've already gone over my time, so thanks much, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. The notion of a Geneva Digital Convention or Quantum Convention, it's interesting because Steve, sort of teeing off the event, mentioned, one of the early conventions against arms was undertaken, of course, by Tsar Alexander, and the reason why he led it is because he was the weakest of the great powers, and it failed. It failed for other reasons, and one text that many of us teach who are international relations scholars here is Kant's Perpetual Peace. And he talks about the need, not for like the weakest country, but for the strongest country to make a unilateral gesture, to start something like an arms control, a radical transformation in how we deal with a weapon like cyber or quantum. Now you've had a lot of, clearly you've been in in various situations, but also maybe in the sit room, or, oh no, they don't need reporters down there, do they?
Oh, more than you would think.
Oh really? Okay.
Yeah, they just don't talk about it.
Okay. Well, in this regard, you have sort of a more intimacy with the people who talk about this or don't in the U.S. national security system. Is there any possibility of convincing the most powerful country, probably still, in this technology to make that unilateral gesture and go to the table, get the people together, and negotiate that quantum convention?
I hope so, and I think that there was some discussion early in the Obama years about whether they could do it. There was a UN group, a committee of experts that sort of put together some set of rules. That then fell apart about 2 years ago. There's been almost no effort toward it since. And in fact, it was interesting that when a group of companies actually put this together with the French president, Macron, on the 100th anniversary of World War I, they got a lot of countries to sign on, but the two democracies that did not sign on were the United States and India. And I can imagine why. Because imagine for a minute that you had a digital Geneva Convention. And by the way, the idea comes from, it's not original to me. The one that's talked about it the most is Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft. Imagine for a minute that you're Mike Pompeo and you're about to go off and do just what you suggested, James. You send this memo out to your cabinet colleagues and you say, "Dear Acting Secretary of Defense, dear Acting," no, we've got a lot of actings these days, okay? "I'm thinking of going and starting this discussion with the Chinese and the Russians." You're going to have a sit-room meeting for sure. And it's one in which the CIA chief says, "I know you guys all think it's a great idea to ban manipulating elections, but if that's our best way to get somebody like Maduro out without sending in troops, who wants to tie the hands of a future president? I know you think it's great to cut off the power systems because the Russians have implants throughout our systems, but if we really need to go to war with Iran, Nitro Zeus is going to be right back on the shelf. I know you think it's good to try to preserve emergency communications, but the first thing we'll want to do is cut the communications between political leadership and the rest of their country." I don't think we'd go there for a long time.
Thank you, David, for that engaging presentation. I'm Ron Diebert, Director of Citizen Lab. And thank you for your reporting over the years as well on this topic. It's been outstanding.
You guys do some of the most interesting reporting we have out there.
Appreciate it. So I love the presentation. At the same time, I'd like to make a comment. I feel there's a pretty important gap in the analysis. And I'll say it this way. You mentioned at the outset that you have China, Russia, North Korea, and they all have their different flavors, which I agree very much with. At the same time, there's one thing that unites them, especially China and Russia. So if you remember back in 2009, I was the principal investigator of the first public evidence-based report on cyber espionage. I gave the exclusive to your colleague, John Markoff, at the time. It was the GhostNet report. And that exposed a massive Chinese cyber espionage operation that now become quite common, but at the time it was novel to expose something like this. That started in the office of the Dalai Lama, and it was Tibetan organizations that we were studying that led us to this mistakes on the part of the attackers to see the rest of the victims, many of which were NGOs. We've been studying Chinese espionage ever since, and the same threat actors, we've shown empirically, APT1 and all the numbers that are given to them, the very same threat actors that target the private sector and government routinely go after civil society, journalists, human rights defenders, lawyers, humanitarians, and so on. Russia, same deal. We did a report slightly after the DNC hack where we showed a colleague of yours, David Satter, at the Financial Post, was part of the same campaign by Fancy Bear. They took his emails, doctored them, make it appear as if he's a CIA agent. Tainted leaks was the report. On top of that, we've done extensive reporting on the proliferation of commercial spyware to authoritarian regimes. We simply can't keep up in terms of the volume of targeted cyber attacks, not against states or critical infrastructure, but against civil society. And I think it's kind of like a silent epidemic. Cyber war is happening all the time. It's just, we're the only ones looking at this. Private sector are looking at threats to company. The intelligence community is looking at states and critical infrastructure. Who's looking at threats to the NGOs and civil society?
You don't have to convince us because we're target of each one of those, along the way. But yeah, go on.
Next will be Peter.
David, my sense is that the people who run the nuclear command and control system assume that the adversaries are already inside. And just as our adversaries assume we're already inside their systems. And, they're loitering, they're learning, their positioning, but the assumption is that they won't actually be able to disable the retaliatory strike that is the basis of deterrence. I don't think you dismiss the notion of a Geneva agreement of some kind. You posed it as a sort of formal treaty which will be very, very difficult to achieve. There are, of course, many codes out there of conduct which are voluntary but do have real power, and just harmonizing standards, expectations, best practice, communication between these different systems seems to me that that is something that there is interest in the American leadership and the military leadership in pursuing. And in fact, there are examples of this, real precedents where you would not expect it to have happened, but when you look at the strategic arms limitation treaties, there is the non-interference clause with national technical means, which has been extremely effective over many, many years. So I wonder to what extent there isn't, in fact, a self-interest in certain aspects of transparency and sharing in these systems that could, in fact, be highly important, and that small middle powers like Australia, which hosts one of the key links in the American system, couldn't be quite important in conceptualizing and advancing.
Thanks, David. I guess as an international relations scholar, and perhaps not as a journalist, one has sometimes a sense of an eternal return and also a tendency to push back against too much identification of newness. And what I'm a little bit struck by, and it was maybe just a comment or something you can do something with, is that where you started, which was the definition of this new threat, the latest new threat, which was terrorism in the early 2000s, right? What was striking about that threat in our terms is that it really brought in a new type of actor, right? And especially created a new form of war, right? Which moved war away from the state. What's striking about the cyber stuff that you've just presented is that actually it brings the state right back in front and center to the forms of warfare that are developing. So in that sense, yeah, it feels perhaps not so new to some of us.
Well, I think your point and your point are actually related here, because the reason formal treaties won't work in this area is that we have so many different actors. There are states, there are terror groups, there are non-state actors, there are criminal groups, there are teenagers, right? And I don't know about in your household, but in my household, the teenagers do not sign treaties. And so one of the big differences between the kind of agreements you were discussing was we had a very limited, in the nuclear age, we had a very limited group of people we knew we had to go negotiate with. And that's one of the reasons the non-interference clauses worked, because we knew exactly who had the capability here and who we were worried about. In the cyber age, you don't. And that's one of the reasons the attribution is so difficult. I mean, we've got many cases, and I'm sure you've seen many at Citizen Lab, in which it just takes months to figure out, was this a state actor, a non-state actor acting on behalf of the state, a non-state actor who was freelancing in the evening to make a few bucks. And in China is a great example of that, because there are a lot of state-run hacks, and then these guys go rent themselves out in the evening, and that may be some of the time when they go after an NGO, right? So it's a much more complex deterrence problem, and it's a much more complex norm-setting problem. The Digital Geneva Convention isn't really about doing what we did in those treaties. If you think about the real Geneva Conventions, a couple interesting things. One, they weren't formed together by governments. They were brought together by the Red Cross. Sort of interesting. An NGO that sort of ended up doing this. And a lot of the governments were opposed to it, but basically over time had to accept the rules that were set. The second interesting thing is they were incredibly focused on civilians, right? So we understand they're not fully enforceable, and we also understand that Bashar Assad wakes up every morning trying to think about how he's going to violate the Geneva Conventions today, and he usually does a pretty good job by the evening. But we're all sitting there in the hope that some number of years from now he'll get dragged in front of an international court and have to pay for gassing his own people. So I actually have a fair bit of hope that the Digital Geneva Convention concept might work, but I don't think it's going to work with governments. I think it's going to have to work around governments and force them into it the way the real Geneva Conventions did.
Please join me in thanking David Cunningham.